Beginning the recording now. Welcome everyone to this AI ethics seminar. Our speaker today is Stefan Larsson, Associate Professor of Technology and Social Change at Lund University. Most welcome to you.
Thank you.
And to the audience. Stefan will speak about ethics guidelines as a tool for AI governance in the EU and its member states. We're going to have a Q&A session at the end, and I encourage you to submit questions and comments via the chat function. And I'll distribute the word between you during the Q&A. All right. Please, Stefan. Go ahead.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. So for me, it's no problem to post questions or ask questions during the talk or interrupt me. I'm perfectly fine with that. Maybe mostly conveniently sending questions to Ulla, perhaps. I'm going to use a few slides here to try to explain a few of the points I want to make. One thing would be the book. We released it yesterday, where we analyzed to what extent the pan-European sort of notions of trustworthy and human-centric AI, the sort of value approach to AI in EU, and to what extent they actually trickle down to member states' strategies. Because whatever Europe makes up, whatever the Commission says, if it, the success rate of that depends on whatever the member states are doing. So that would be the final section of the talk today. So yeah, as Olle said, I'm Stefan Larsson. I'm what we call a associate professor in technology and social change. So there's something on society and tech, right? That dependence in a sense. My background is very much in social sciences with a legal touch, so to speak. I'm a lawyer, but I use law mainly as a thing to study in relationship to new technologies, because I think that's, to me, that's an extremely interesting sort of relationship. How do you steer? How should we steer as a society new technologies, and particularly so in this case, artificial intelligence. Not an easily defined concept, but still very interesting, because there's so much governance talk and regulatory discussions at the moment. This is a very formative period when it comes to AI, particularly so in Europe, I think. Also so in Sweden. I just want to mention also I'm from the outside Gothenburg. I'm from Kungsbacka, Onsala. If you're from that area, that's where I grew up. So I would normally, or if had this been a year ago, I would have been in Gothenburg now. That would have been nice, actually. But those are not the times. So now we meet up like this. So I went to Lund to study law, actually. And as you see, I have 2 PhDs. And to me, both of them are, how do we regulate new technologies? One on file sharing and that type of copyright issues, and the other one on wind power and mobile telephony. So base stations in the landscape, basically. Briefly, I've divided what I'm touching upon into 4 sections. I mean, the new book on human-centered AI would be what I reach for, but to be able to understand why Europe has taken this approach and what it means, one has to look at a grander debate on ethics guidelines overall, because this has been like a surge of ethics guidelines, you could say, all over the globe the last 3 or 4 years. So that has been a very common notion of how to govern AI, just through ethics guidelines. But in order to understand why, then we need to look at more of the multidisciplinary approaches. So the increased awareness of that there are actually some really worrisome risks or downsides with applying machine learning and facial recognition or predictive tools in society. So So whatever you develop and you put it in society on markets, stuff will happen. And especially so if it's autonomous things, there's a new sort of set of problems that emerges then. So that's the beginning of the story today. What does that increased awareness entail, and what does it come from? And then I move on to sort of the steering ideas, the governance ideas. I based this on a number of papers I've written, and so you could find them if you want to dig deeper. Today I'm more moving over this area in a sense. So the type of research projects I'm working on right now are mostly in this area, but in different sectors. So I'm not like, for example, a medical AI researcher who do social science in relationship to medical AI only, in a sense. I'm looking for the relationship between autonomous technologies and society, and I see that the same type of challenges plays out in different sectors. So I would argue that it's the same set of challenging problems in retail, for example. Do you get the correct shoe ads or not? Is Coop and ICA predicting correctly, and do people get offended by that or not? It's the same sort of problems as in medical AI to some extent, when you predict skin cancer or try to make automated recommendations for triage. It's just that the stakes are very different. So it doesn't matter that much if you get the wrong shoe ads, but if you are told you have cancer when you don't have it, or vice versa, that's high stakes, right? But I'm keen on that engine from a social scientific perspective to figure that out. So I do that in various different projects with various types of different stakes, and primarily at Lund University. But I'm also linked to or affiliated to or try to contribute to authorities like DIG or the Consumer Agency, because I see that they are increasingly also facing these issues. And I would love to be able to contribute more on this sort of social scientific perspective for Konsumentverket, the Consumer Agency, for example, when they look at markets that are increasingly automated, increasingly predictive, but it's the same regulatory setting for them, and they struggle having the competences of looking at that market when it's automated. So that's sort of a aim I have. I want to contribute as much as I can outside academia as well. Now, the first paper deals in general with governance of AI through ethics guidelines, which I think is an interesting topic as such. You could argue that ethics guidelines, well, they have some benefits. They are quickly drafted, which sometimes is good. They have a principle strength. I mean, we look for the values inherent in them, which is a debate that needs to be done. What do we care about? Is it transparency? Is it accountability? What is it? So that's good. The bad stuff is more, well, being ethics guidelines, they don't have the methodologies that law has. They don't have the punishments or the fees to deliver. So they are not a hammer as law can be. They are strong on principle count. So that's interesting in that sense. But looking at number one then, the increased awareness, I'm just passing through this debate because I see, we can all see indications also in engineering sectors that, okay, what about design and ethics? It tends to be spoken in terms of ethics, right? Ethics is often the word that are used in engineering sciences when we talk about values and principles. So, but ethics, it's not probably always in the sense of how ethicists talk about ethics, and most philosophers does not necessarily always agree. I think that the use of that terminology is what they think of ethics, because just as often we talk about strictly legal issues or human rights, for example. But anyways, the increased awareness has been going on for a couple of years, and you see sort of the types of terminologies that have been linked to autonomous design. stuff like transparency, accountability, human rights for that matter. And you see that also in the traditional AI conferences like this one, the AAAI, which has developed a subsection called IS, or Artificial Intelligence, Ethics and Society. So pointing to the link that, okay, we might need more knowledge in the interplay between values, society, and autonomous systems, or AI. And of course, in Sweden, we have this program, and you have researchers at Chalmers as well, funded by it, where the sort of large program on its own on WASP, the Wallenberg AI Autonomous Systems and Software Program. So that sort of engineering focused large program also branched off and said, well, there are consequences and reasons for also humanities and social sciences to study and try to figure out whatever consequences there are, and whatever we should know from a regulatory or social or cultural or ethical perspective. So that program is 10-year, and also an indication on that. Okay, there's a growing awareness of the implications of AI as AI plays out in society or interacts with. And also the conference called FAT before, it's also these are all indications that there is need to understand the relationship between AI and society more thoroughly. Issues that are very much technology related, but very much not possible to solve or figure out from a pure engineering or tech perspective. So that's one argument, right? To just sort of dig a little bit deeper into that without talking for hours. This sort of multidisciplinary argument, I think, is interesting. And one way to try to frame that is using a paper from a researcher called Yad Rawan. He's written this paper on society in the loop. I mean, deliberately using terminology that you would think in terms of programming, human in the loop, but then using society in the loop. So that's a big sort of philosophical claim almost. But in a way, it serves the purpose of framing whatever expectations you put on technologies and the sort of algorithm developments and AI system development. These expectations are often found and defined or emerge in society in some way. So it could be, issues of fairness or issues of explainability. Humans need to understand this, scrutiny, like supervision from authorities, or the values we have in society, what we basically think is fair, even though the definition of fairness is far from simple. But still, we have disciplines that have studied things like ethics for at least, well, ethics in particular for 2,000 years. So that's a long tradition. But then regulatory studies also, we still have Roman law in our Swedish law, which is remnants of a 2,000-year-old regime. But then social norms, maybe since the late 1800s, Durkheim, stuff like that. So we have bits and pieces of different social, scientific, and humanistic disciplines studying issues like that to figure out, okay, what are these expectations on societies coming from societies? Those, I argue here through this article, defines many of the issues in the engineering-based AI research. So whenever we make claims that we should understand, we need these tools to be more explainable, well, it's based in something on a human sort of notion of explainability. We need to figure that out. Or results of consequences in, or how does it relate to ethnicity or social structures? That's sort of these two sides in an interplay, right? If you optimize, what do you optimize for, so to speak? Fairness, I'm not going to dig much into that, but it's on a sort of in a mundane, everyday meaning. You could debate, who do you define it? Well, in some extent, in democratic societies, we have representative democracies with parliament saying, this should be a new law. So in some sense, in that sense, it's a political event, partly at least, which defines the law, which lawyers apply, and we all abide, maybe, hopefully, mostly. So that's also sort of a definition of fairness, and that plays into tech development. One challenge, which I will return to a bit more, which is found in this interplay, is that contemporary AI is very much data dependent. So you have tools or methodologies in machine learning that depends on whatever data the algorithms are trained on. That data then will define many of the issues coming out. And when we are that data, our patterns, our behavior, our sort of social structures, then that will be put into the training. So whatever flaws or whatever weird behavior we have, whatever bad stuff we do, that's also the training data, which also is entering into this sort of intersection or interplay between society and AI. That means that we want to figure out what's really bad in some of the applications that went wrong. Then we need to figure out what's wrong in society. It's not that racism and inequalities was invented by a coder or an algorithm developer. It's not that, but it's just that is using the patterns of society, which creates a big type of challenge, which means you need to have both sides present. You need to have different types of expertise present to be able to deal with those types of complex issues. And then, which I'm not going to develop here, then there's always like very, humans always have incentives to do bad stuff, right? There's always like fraud or criminal intent or a whole range of incentives to misuse also whatever good design that's been made. But I'm not going to dig into that. So we're going to focus on number 2, I think. And I want to do that in 2 different ways, because I see that the ramifications or consequences of these 2 ways are different. Let me develop what I mean. One way would be, what if the data is not representing the world in a good way? It's biased in that sense. That's one problem. To use an example, I sometimes look at ImageNet, which is a huge database on basically pre-tagged images. So humans have spent lots of time to looking at images and saying and stating what's in the images. So this is a bear, and this is a bear, and this is what a bear, and this is also a bear, and then continued like, this is a chair. Wow, nice, not a bear. And now we have a ball, and done that for 14 million images, which is impressive, but also proven to be very useful for the types of methodology development that deals with precision in images. It has been really good for that type of technical development. So the accuracy in classifying what's in an image has increased pretty quickly over a few years only, to be almost better than humans, what we can do with image. Now that's great, right? Is there a problem in terms of biases here? Well, not for stuff that doesn't have a cultural component. A bear is likely a bear all over the world, right? But when you look at other stuff, like wedding dresses, for example, they don't look the same in different parts of the world. So to be able to classify a wedding dress, it depends. That ability depends very much on where from you get the data. So if you have data from the US or Europe, which is very much the case in ImageNet, then you have a bias towards accuracy for US and European wedding dresses, which is a case study by Shankar and fellows, which means that if you train your your neural networks on this data set, it gets good on detecting stuff that looks like what's in the database, basically. But when if you ask it to classify North Indian bride dresses or wedding dresses, or Pakistani, I think was also in the paper, then it's not as good, right? It's not as accurate. So then it could misclassify those the true wedding dresses into performance art or costumes, which is a problem. And you get something that's less precision, and it has a cultural component. So it's basically probably the database misrepresenting the world, you could say. But it has a cultural component, which is a problem. So these researchers, they at least argue for, well, we need to have more of a assessment, a geodiversity assessment, so we at least see what's skewed or biased, and we have to accept the fact that there's less accuracy for some phenomena. So now you see the case. The data is not representing the world as the world is. That could lead to a bunch of problems in terms of accuracy. And when it comes to wedding dresses, that's not necessarily offensive or violent, but when it comes to facial recognition, you could see the same sort of problems that have been acknowledged in some studies, like commercial image recognition services. Bulanwini and Gebru, they assessed 3 different types that are used and sold on the market, and they were clearly had much less precision for dark and female faces, which is not anomalies or weird minorities. It's the majority, is half at least of everyone. So that's more concerning, right? And if you put those types of, and now I'm just being speculative, but returning to the stakes notion, if you put those types of systems and sort of biased databases and the applications trained on them into autonomous driving, then the stakes are higher, right? Then you might, at worst case, have a system that's poorer in detecting some pedestrians than others, depending on the facial color and structures of the faces. And then we have a much bigger problem than wedding dresses, I guess. So you see the example here. So that's also a sort of an argument that, okay, we need to pay attention to these biases, because what they mean is not always readily available. It's not always that we can figure the true problem out until we put them in an applied context and realize, yeah, this is discriminatory, or this is actually insecure. So that leads me to another question. What about can automation be normative? Can it has a normative? Can it reproduce bad stuff or even amplify them? Stuff that we normally don't want to be reproducing. So I'm using a paper that was a study on ad privacy settings. So that was like an automated system for ad distribution, and they studied how job ads were distributed. And first of all, it was really hard to look at it, because it was a proprietary software, a Google thing. So they couldn't just assess it. They had to develop a tool on their own to be able to even scrutinize sort of the effects of this job ad recommendation. And sort of more concerning was that they also found that it was a gender bias in the job ads. So more often you had well-paid jobs sent to men than women, which then that asks a bunch of questions, which they don't really answer in the paper. But to me, it leads to the question that, well, the design was most likely not intending to discriminate between gender, right? It was just sort of looking for okay, what's on the market? How do we define relevancy depending on what's out there? And how do we sort of mirror that so we can send relevant job ads? Now, that would probably so that the job market is discriminatory. So we don't have the same pay for same job depending on gender, which is a problem on its own that we try to regulate through law and have authorities to supervise. But when you put that into an automated system to interact with, then you get sort of at worst case, you reproduce that and even amplify. So you add to it. So then you, at worst case, have sort of a normative automation that amplifies stuff that we try to get rid of in society. And that problem is not then like the first one. It's not that the data is misrepresenting the world. It's actually representing the world. But there are structures in society that we are not proud of and we try to get rid of. But the challenge then would be, where do you sort of talk about accountability here? Where do you point fingers? Should the automated tool try to have a normative stance in diminishing this inequality, or can it say we're just a platform, we just I don't know, automate this thing, we don't care? And then you have a bunch of cases that deals with this issue, basically, that the origin of the bad stuff is in society, like the chatbot Tay that was in conversation with other tweeters became racist and anti-feminist and like Hitler. So and same with Facebook audio-generated categories, because it picked up stuff that people did on the platform. So the problem is more like, where do you talk about accountability? Where do you who did wrong? Well, there's some of the tricky questions when you automate things, and maybe particularly when you scale things. So you have over 1 billion users, then you need to automate stuff if you want that to work, like Facebook products or Google products. But it's not necessarily easily done, and you need to look at those types of applied AI in a sense. So moving on to guidelines, I'm checking my clock here. Are we gonna have maximum 15 minutes more, I think. Guidelines, this is Berkman Klein Center looking at all guidelines the last few years. You see there's a whole range from private sector, civil society, government, and various types of guidelines. So we're not going to go through all of them, of course. It's just make the argument that this has been a wave rolling in a sense, which serves many purposes. And interestingly enough, there's few concepts that have been really important: transparency, fairness, not doing bad things, accountability and privacy. The problem, though, has been that there's been big differences in what you mean with these concepts. So that's a challenge on its own, right? It's the same. But then we move to Europe, I'm thinking, and here it is. So now we actually reached the book. This book, of course, we tried to explain the overall EU take on AI. I'm going to do that very briefly. We had a commentary on that from Fredrik Heinz, which you may know, who was a part of the high-level expert group that has been pretty key to define how the EU stance has been developed or produced or sort of framed on trustworthy AI. So he made a comment in the book, but we also then looked at a number of countries. I'm not going to talk much about that, but just so you see how we try to figure out how the European level plays out in these countries. I don't know to what extent you're aware of these developments, but in Sweden, for example, we had a very thin early version of approach for AI. Was not really a strategy. They don't even call it a strategy these days, but it's the only public document that's been produced in Sweden that can be called something of a strategy. So in the EU, the development has a few key documents. For example, when the Commission set up what is called an AI strategy in April 18, so 2.5 years ago, that's basically when it started. So it's kind of a quick journey, you would say, in terms of in compared to regulatory developments, and most importantly, the coordinated plan in late 18, that's 2 years ago, that plan told all member states or encouraged them to develop AI strategies by mid-19. So quite a quick run for states to develop or produce AI strategies. So a bunch of member states did not manage to produce. So they were late in a sense. But in parallel to what Commission has written, the high-level expert group has produced 4 different types of documents, of which the blue and the green are the most important. And that would be the ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI on one hand, and then policy and investment recommendations, which is they are both echoed in the white paper that was published in February, which we don't really yet see where it lands. It proposes a bunch of stuff. I may touch upon it in a slide, but we don't really. We're still in the step, I guess. The guidelines focus a number of issues, of which I think the 7 listed are the most key, covering maybe too much ground in a sense, but very much an interesting focus on human agency, so the human in the loop or on the loop or in control, whatever terminology, all of them are in there. And then, of course, the robustness and safety aspects. Privacy, number 3 and number 5 are very much regulated stuff already, interestingly enough. So privacy, diversity, and non-discrimination, but also transparency, which is not as regulated. So that depends on how you define it very much. And number 6, I think, is an issue that we haven't seen much talk about, like the link between AI systems, maybe data infrastructures, and environmental issues. I think that would be a conversation growing next year. And of course, accountability issues, which is very much, linked to AI and society debates. I'm not going to focus the policy investment recommendations because it's even more complex. But in general, balance between, okay, good for society, but we need more money into it. So these 2 types of like industrial attempts but not leading to bad things. So that's sort of a general challenge that EU, I think, often finds itself in. And you see that echoed in the white paper as well. Okay, we need to be excellent, have access to lots of data on the one hand, not problems, no problems. And on the other hand, we need to have trusted applications that are secure and people can use and want to use. So that 2 sides are sort of, in my view, struggling a bit. One is more in like industrial focused, the other one is more like law and governance focused. And in the book, and what I'm pretty much interested in is what the white paper says about coming regulatory talk, particularly so on transparency and sort of, the challenges of this changing functionality of AI systems. That possibly could have like a journey from, design through the data use in whomever you rent it to or sell it to, and how it plays out at a later stage. These are sort of new regulatory challenges, which I also mentioned before with depending on what data you let the system depend on. So the countries, as I mentioned, strategies came in different, at different times. So you can't really expect the Finnish or Swedish to be very much informed by the European level because they were so early. But you see much sort of the Portuguese or the Polish or the Norwegian, which is not EU but still was part of this coordinated plan. They are much more influenced by the ethics guidelines then. The Polish last version is just a draft. We'll see when it's gonna get more public though. And lastly, let's wrap this up. I think the core argument, I think, in the beginning of this talk was that society sets the expectations for AI development. So whatever, if you want them to be fair, you need to define fairness. Fairness can be defined in different ways. Parts of that is just political structures. So we say, yes, we want equality. Well, that's part of fairness. Then that needs to, then that it is fed into some parts of AI development. If it should be sustainable, that would be using less energy, for example. Yeah, that is an emerging sort of a preference for training of neural networks. We will talk about green AI more next year, I would say. Explainability is one of those sort of topics as well. So not only for the one developing a tool or a complex prediction sort of to understand how it got to its functionality, but also when you place that in a social or societal context, how should human users, I don't know, I go to, I apply for a new loan and I get a risk, you know, I get a yes or no depending on a risk prediction on me in combination with data from lots of other lenders. I want to understand that, especially when I get a no, then I really want to understand that. So when you put some of these methodologies in like public sector or, you know, in society on markets, then you get a whole range of expectations on them, some of which are transparency and maybe particularly to explainability. We want to understand how we got to this decision or recommendation. So that's the interplay argument, right? So that's basically the parts of the multidisciplinary argument. And I'm strongly, you saw also where I came from, lawyer, studying tech, moving to social sciences. Now I'm teaching at the engineering faculty. So it's not weird that I make this type of argument, but I really am a proponent, especially when you develop machine learning, depending on data online, put it on markets in companies and on the public sector. You have a whole range of challenges in there, which you need great technologies, but you also need lawyers for some problems or a gender expert for some other problems. So I think we are strong in monodisciplinary research often, at least, but we are, at least in Sweden, not always as strong on the combination of disciplines. From a more regulatory perspective, guidelines, as I said initially, are good in one sense. They are swift. You can define and develop them quickly. But this is an ongoing problem that's been debated in social legal research for at least 150 years. How do you merge societal development and make that relate to regulatory ideas quickly? How do you have you can't really regulate ahead, not too much at least. It's very hard to make good law for something that's coming. So it's always going to be like a lag of law in one sense. And the problem is how much of the tech-driven development can you allow before you find out the sort of key governance issues. So I think that guidelines are strong in that sense. They're swift and look at it, but they are very weak in terms of specific problems or having the hammer ready when something should be illegal. Law is much better on that, of course, being law, but it's many of these guidelines are also kind of weak in methodology. So when should they be, how should they be applied? Who could appeal? Who's the judge? You know, these types of methodological stuff that law is strong at. Which was that point, actually? How do you move from principles to process? I think that's what EU is trying to do, and we are still in sort of the leap. So we will need to to continue looking at those issues, at least me. And lastly then, which we didn't talk about, I was kind of sweeping on the how do you define AI, because sometimes it seems like everything is AI, which is not, but still AI as a research discipline has also been moving very much over the almost 70 years it's been used as a terminology. So it doesn't mean now what it used to mean, and it's hard to define it as a research discipline, but it's important to at least attempt to define it clearly when you use it as a governance tool, because these two uses are different. I think it could be beneficial to have a not so fixed definition when you develop things, and we want research to be creative, but when you regulate stuff and say that this behavior is wrong, illegal or not, then that definition has to be clear cut. And that's also one of the problems that the ethics guidelines facing when taking the leap towards regulation. But that's another lecture, I think. So we will also see, which is more speculative, that all of these ethics guidelines tend to be on a general level. So any AI on any issues on fairness, but much of the challenge will be coming in sort of sectors. So do we talk about health sector? They have their own specific stakes and specific professions that will have to deal with these recommendation tool or predictive tools, or even possibly automated decisions. Or do we deal with other versions of the public sector, or are we talking about, what are we talking about? So the sectoral aspect will be next, in the time to come, to talk more about. And then we have also a whole range of assessments of contemporary law. Is it, fit to the challenge? Does it need to be amended? Or is it more of an implementation issue? How about the supervisory authorities then? Should data inspection and data protection authorities or the consumer agencies, do they have the tools to assess a market that's becoming more and more AI driven? At the moment, most likely not, I would say. But they are increasingly facing that issue, especially when it comes to the large scale platforms that we all use and depend upon. Like Zoom, almost. Thank you. So, Olle.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for a very interesting overview and important perspectives.
Thank you.
I invite questions. As I suggested, you can post them in the chat, but I think that it will work fine also if you just grab the microphone and shout out your question.
Can I grab the microphone there?
Absolutely.
Yes. Thanks. Impressed by 84 different sets of guidelines.
Yes.
And the promise on the conclusion slide of more to come. So what advice would you give to time-pressed researchers about how to navigate this landscape of guidelines?
Advice? Well, I guess one need to have a skeptical also or a critical eye to them, that they may serve different purposes, of course, depending on who's devising them. So it's not necessarily always the main attempt to have a clear-cut normative approach on the world when it comes to AI. It could also be that they want to avoid the regulation. That could also be one thing. So yeah, I think it's a research project on its own to just map it out. That's maybe the first reply, I guess. But I think guidelines is intriguing in the sense that they have a normative claim, but it's hard to really pinpoint what they really mean, right? So it's a one thing when Google moves. It's another thing when Commission moves. And it's a third thing when, I don't know, a mixed group of stakeholders like IT och telekomföretagen in Sweden. They also had a guideline. So I think to me, it's more like a research question. What does this particular guideline entail and mean? You can't take them for granted in that sense.
Can I comment a little bit on this question too?
Sure.
So I think this having 84 different sets of guidelines, that's surely offers a richness of perspectives and can be very useful for someone looking for ethical advice. But I think that there's a particular way that one could use this, which I would very strongly disrecommend. And that is if you want to carry on with a particular AI project, then probably among these 84 different sets of guidelines, you can find the one which is the most permissive as it was what you want to do. And that's not really the way to approach this ethically.
Now that would be like shopping for laws that fit your needs, like. But some companies globally do that too, and when it comes to labor law, for example, let's put this activity in the country that allows it, even if it's bad.
Yes.
So that it's true.
And the country that has the most lax regulation of the labor market.
Yeah. Which some like content moderation social media companies are allegedly doing when they rent people in the Philippines to do the content moderation. Then legally it's much easier for them to have people in the Philippines doing it, even if it's the most crappy job on the planet, I would say, because you put the worst part of humanity in front of someone's eyes, and they should flag or remove content, and it could be any bad stuff. So that's used, at least, even if it's not recommended, I think.
Are there further questions or comments?
Well, Graham, what's your background, if I may ask?
I'm at Chalmers in the Department of Computer Science and Engineering. My own research is in bioinformatics, mainly.
Bioinformatics, okay.
So I have a question regarding this process of developing an AI ethics framework within the European Union. Do you think that this process, which is obviously ongoing, has it been hampered by the COVID-19 pandemic, or is it the kind of activity that goes on unhampered by that?
Good question. I mean, I think the key documents when it comes to ethics guidelines and the policy recommendations were published before the pandemic. So that part, at least, you could say was unhampered. The last two publications were sectoral guidelines and improved assessment list. They were published this summer, so that would then the question would be more relevant. But it's hard for me as an external party to assess to what extent what could have been. Both of these documents were assessed in with invited persons, so they had some sort of online meetings to discuss them. But to what extent that would have been better or worse, online or not online, it's hard. I'm not sure. It's hard to say. We saw, I mean, some of the local but national guidelines were delayed, so that would probably be because of maybe like a shift of priorities in the countries. Like the Polish one, it was supposed to be published in early this year, but it was published a month ago. So that one was probably just probably it's no public statements about it, but you could assume it's due to the pandemic. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's better or worse because it took time, right? It's hard to say.
Yeah. Another question I have concerns the relation to the rest of the world. I tend to feel that what humanity needs is a global coordination on AI ethics issues. Does the European Union have a particular outlook on the world?
Yes, it does, it seems. But that's, I mean, I can't speak thoroughly about Chinese or US strategies, but I, at least to the extent, know they are different. And seen some papers on that too. The US tends to be more private and company-based, and the Chinese has its own, own state system, you could say. So Europe strikes me as different in terms of putting the emphasis on trustworthiness and ethics and human centricity. That's at least on a conceptual level, it's very different. And it's also pointed out the privacy aspects, which doesn't seem to be emphasized in the other one. So I think we could at least see this as a part of like a geopolitical competition, so to speak. But it's a pretty grand question, I think, to answer thoroughly. But it's, I think, a very good question, a very important question to look at more. And I think that we see also at the companies and sort of what's been developed in the private sectors. You have like the top most valued companies in the US. So you have the Alphabet, Amazon, Facebooks, and Apple, for example, and Microsoft on the one hand, and then the growing sort of the coming below in terms of how much assets they have and how they are the market cap. They are Chinese. So you have the Tencent and the Alibaba. So all of these companies start to compete in terms of aggregation of money and sort of what they mean to the world, but none of them are European. So that's also an added part to the mix of geopolitical sort of struggle. But this is more, I think, political scientific knowledge we need to understand what it means, in a sense that Europe is talking about all of these ethics guidelines and fairness and trustworthiness, but don't really have the companies that they would be aiming for them, so I think it's interesting, but I think it then also, to me, that's creating a link that we have to understand ethics guidelines also in the light of regulation of platforms, the regulation of data, whatever companies we have in Europe, because it's so different from the US and China. So we also have movements in competition regulation in Europe, for example. We will soon see the Commission produce the Digital Services Act, which is very much a regulatory approach on large scale platforms as stakeholders, which mean, in practice means regulating US companies in Europe. So to me, these two are not expressively linked, but they are linked in practice, I'd say.
Okay, thank you. Further questions or comments? Oh, there's actually one more thing I would like to bring up, and that is the tension or the possible tension between, on the European level, between protecting the citizens and protecting the industry climate, the private sector.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you see that also in these documents, particularly the policy recommendations and the white paper. The division between trying to stimulate the industry, but on the other hand, sort of, fairness, transparency, and sort of human control is important. I think it seems like a battle going on also within. And I guess, so how that will play out is very important, but it's hard to predict. I'm keen on a counter question if we have time, because I'm stressing the multidisciplinary argument. And at least on surface level, the big old universities like, I don't know, Uppsala and Lund has an advantage in terms of that we have, engineers and lawyers and cultural scientists in the close, but on a more administrative or organizational level, we are still very much apart. So it's hard to find the structures how you enable this sort of collaboration without very strong efforts need to be made to do it. But how do you experience that same issue in Chalmers and maybe linked to Gothenburg University? Or how can we, if you agree, stimulate that type of cross-disciplinary, just sharing ideas or developing projects?
Yeah. So I would say, if you combine Chalmers and the University of Gothenburg, we'll probably have a similar breadth of competence and power as does Lund and Uppsala. And there have been some initiatives in the AI field for collaborations, for stimulating collaborations across disciplines and between Chalmers and Gothenburg University. And most of all, between Chalmers and the medical faculty, the Sahlgrenska. But I'm sure you could criticize the city's environment as regards AI work to still be a bit shattered.
Or encourage there's more to be done. But that's a challenge, I think. And I don't think often the hinder is not that people don't want it. It's more like the traditional structures is hard to, the walls are hard to climb, because it's also between faculties in Lund, it's harder to work jointly with people at other faculties, even if they just sit on the other side of the road, basically.
You mean for organizational reasons?
Yeah, more for organizational reasons. People start debating overhead costs and you have to apply a year ahead to create this course if you want it to be applied to all university, not just the faculty.
That is unfortunate because the discrepancies in academic traditions and so on can be difficult enough mountain to climb. So you don't want to have the organizational problems on top of that.
No, I feel that they are. But then we tried to develop like AI Lund, which is a research network where we just try to not care too much about those things and say that whatever, if people do good stuff and want to be part of it, just join and we do stuff.
That's I think a very good approach.
Yeah.
All right. If there are no further questions or comments, I think we can give Stefan a virtual applause.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Nice.
Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Next year will be in Gothenburg, I hope.
Looking forward to that. See you then.
Yes.